Hi, I am Dr. Felice, your integrative physician, speaking to you from my office in Irvine, sunny Southern California. And I'm here today to continue the story on fasting for women, a very, very important story that all of you should know about because I know you're listening because you care about your health. You want to have the most enjoyable, optimally healthy life as long as possible. And fasting is one of the major tools that almost everyone can access to have healthy longevity. So, first, for those of you who are new to my show, I would like to just introduce myself. I am, as I mentioned, Dr. Felice Gersh. I am board certified in the new field of integrative medicine and also obstetrics and gynecology. I blend these two specialties to offer all of my patients the most amazing opportunities to improve their health. So I utilize all evidence-based, efficacious therapies, always starting with lifestyle and safe modalities, of course. So, where does fasting fit into my therapeutic toolbox? I can tell you it has become, over the last several years, a very key part of my program to help myself, because it's part of my healthy longevity program, and for the vast majority of my patients. We've talked about a variety of types of fasting. Time restricted eating, which is fasting for periods of the 24-hour day. And we've talked about intermittent fasting, where we do alternate day fasting and modified fasting and the 5-2. Today, we're going to talk about my favorite type of fasting, which is a type of periodic fasting. Now, periodic meaning that it happens more than once, it's repetitive, and it goes for at least 2 days or longer. So, what happens when you fast for more than 1 day? Well, a lot of the same benefits that you get from a 1-day fast. Say if you're doing an alternate day or a 5-2, where you fast or modify your fast every other day or 2 days out of the week. And as a reminder, those benefits are very substantial. People do tend to lose weight who need to lose weight. They improve many metabolic parameters. They tend to normalize their blood pressure, reduce inflammation. So those are really important, very important aspects of health. What happens when you fast for longer? Well, once you fast for about 3 days, that's where a lot of benefits really start to accrue that you don't see on the shorter fasts. And that's really where I want to focus. So remember, when you fast for several days, and now I'm talking about a water fast where you would have nothing whatsoever except water, you actually have some tremendously different benefits where I call it your body rejuvenates from within. Now, there are some risks if you fast for multiple days at a time, and it's very challenging. I don't know about you, but I have actually never gone more than 1 day without having anything to eat. But I have many, many times done what is called a fasting mimicking diet, which is so easy to do. And for almost everyone, once they get into it and they get prepped for it, they find it easy also. And that's a fasting mimicking diet for 5 days. And in that time frame, you get to eat, but you eat food that is very specifically composed to fly under the radar of the nutrient sensors that are in the brain. Our brains are very tuned into the status of our body's metabolic state. For example, are you getting enough food? Are you getting too much food? And in turn, it regulates our appetite. And in a healthy person, this is a very finely tuned mechanism so that your metabolic needs are met precisely by the consumption of food. I don't know if you thought about that. Isn't it fascinating to think that our brains can, in a healthy person, and by the way, many people no longer have proper control of their appetite, but in a healthy individual, and this would be like a newborn baby who's healthy, they never overeat. they will stop feeding when they're full. However, if you force them to eat and you just chug it down, after a while, they lose that control. That's why you never want to force feed anyone that is not hungry. You want to let their natural appetite regulation take hold. Now, we can help to reestablish this through periodic fasting mimicking diets, which I'll explain. Many of you probably have this problem. You are always hungry. It doesn't matter what time of the day or night. And they've done studies on this where they've given people a buffet. They can choose anything, an Italian buffet, say. And then they say, oh, by the way, after 5 minutes, a pause, it's like, now we're going to put out a Chinese food buffet. And it's amazing. People will go back and they'll eat another full plate of food, like a completely different dinner, right after they ate a completely full, complete dinner. That's because people have lost their finely tuned appetite control mechanisms. Well, it turns out we have these centers, these neurons in our brain that are called nutrient sensors, and they know what you're eating, the composition of the food, and that helps your, in a healthy person, regulation of our appetite, and also helps us to choose the proper foods for what our bodies need. Well, it turns out that these brilliant researchers headed by Professor Walter Longo at the University of Southern California at the Longevity Institute, over 20 years of research, came up with a very precise formulation of food that will trick the nutrient sensors in the brain into thinking that you're not eating, but you are eating. How amazing and fantastic is that? Now, let me go back and tell you a little bit of a story about how I became involved with Professor Longo and the research on the fasting mimicking diet. Several years ago, I had a call to my office from a market researcher who was looking to interview forward-thinking, open-minded, integrative physicians to find out what they thought about fasting and if they thought they would want to include it in their practice. Well, as soon as I heard about it, I was like, of course I want to talk to this person. This sounds really interesting. At that point, of course, I had training in nutrition, but I had no training in fasting. And I really thought this is something I want to learn about. So I went through the whole interview process and I did not know it, but there was a secret second agenda to this marketing researcher's calls. And that was to find a doctor who had a medical practice who would serve as the beta test site to try the fasting mimicking diet in a real life setting. And I passed all the barriers and was chosen. I went through multiple interviews and ultimately ended up on the campus of USC having lunch, which he usually doesn't do, with Professor Walter Longo. He gave me a tour of his lab and he explained all about the fasting mimicking diet. He gave me copies of all of the research to date that had been published, and I just found it so amazing. And I was thrilled when my practice was selected to be the first in the world to try out the fasting mimicking diet. So I tried it out on myself. I found it very tasty and also very easy to do. It turned out because I had been eating a whole foods, very plant-based diet at that point for quite a number of years, that I transitioned seamlessly from using glucose as a fuel to using fat as a fuel. I didn't even feel anything. So I thought, hey, this is so easy. And I started giving it to my patients to try. I found some of them struggled mightily with the process, especially on day 3 of the 5 days, because for many of them, that's when they transitioned fully into a state of ketosis. That's where they're burning only fat. They'd used up all of their glycogen stores in their muscle and their liver. That's how glucose is stored in the body, in the form of glycogen. They had no more glucose stores. And the food that they were eating with the fasting mimicking diet did not provide a lot of glucose. It was predominantly fat. That's the thing. It turns out that protein is one of the key nutrients that the nutrient sensors in the brain pick up upon. So this is a low sugar and a low protein 5-day fasting mimicking diet that is predominantly fat but very tasty. It's not like you're eating a bowl of fat, not at all. I'll explain it in a minute what you actually get to eat. So I found that my patients who had been eating what you might say a standard American diet with lots of processed carbs, when I told them, hey, this is great, you know, it's so easy, I did it, and I found no problem, I felt wonderful, they struggled because their bodies were essentially like rusty. Their mitochondria had not gotten enough practice for who knows how long in burning long-chain fatty acids and medium-chain fatty acids. They were predominantly used to burning glucose because these people were constantly feeding. We've talked about that. If you always eat, your body isn't going to be burning fat because you're constantly providing fuel in the form of glucose. So they really struggled making this transition. And it took a few hours. And during those few hours, they often felt very weak and famished. Like if they didn't eat something, they would literally die, which by the way, they would not. But I learned, and others had learned after some practice, that first of all, the best thing is to do what we call now in my practice, a reset for a month. During that month, we get them into time-restricted eating and eating real food. No more processed food, no processed carbs, no foods that turn rapidly into sugar. So we do predominantly a plant-based diet, and we try to get them to eat a heavy, delicious breakfast, a big breakfast. Stop eating early in the evening, like forks down by 7 p.m. Stop snacking, and we prepare their bodies, get their bodies used to fasting overnight, no late night eating, and start learning how to burn fat again. We also found out that if we gave people who were going through this, if they did struggle converting into a ketotic state, burning fat, that if you gave them just a little bit of fat, just to hold them over while their bodies were getting back the hang of it, of how to burn fat, by giving them just a couple of olives, like say if they're eating the food that has olives that day, they could eat one of their like little snacky items that likes the olives and just have a couple earlier, and then hydrate, lots of hydration, and taking a walk tremendously helped. And then they would get into a state of ketosis, and then suddenly peace, happiness, the crazy, unrestricted appetite, out of control appetite completely fades away. So first, I need to tell you a little bit more about my current involvement with the fasting mimicking diet. After working as a volunteer for a couple of years and trying out and making some modifications just based on my patients' preferences in terms of food items, in terms of flavors and such, after about 2 years, I was invited to actually work with what was then a fledgling company that made a fasting mimicking diet for sale, which they named Prolong, for promoting longevity. And so now my current status is I'm a speaker. So sometimes I give lectures for doctor audiences, sometimes for lay audiences, on the merits of fasting mimicking diets and fasting in general, usually with a focus on females. So that's my disclosure, that's my involvement. Let me tell you a little bit more about what the fasting mimicking diet called Prolong is composed of. You get, on day 1, it's a little bit more food, and you get 2 delicious nut bars, and you also get 2 soups and little extras. I call them doodads, but they're like little extras. It could be like a little tiny brownie, or you get some kale crackers, or you get let me think what else, the olives, the very tasty olives that you get, and then you get some tea bags, and then so you can drink lots of hydration with lots of delicious teas. And then on day 2, 3, 4, and 5, you get 2 soups. So every day you get a soup for lunch and a soup for dinner and a nut bar for breakfast. It's only on day 1 that you get extras and you get 2 nut bars. So the other days, 2, 3, 4, 5, you get a soup for lunch and dinner, and they're variable, they're different types. And you also get a nut bar, and then you get these little extras. So, and you also get some supplements like some vitamins and a little algal oil. So those come in different amounts each day. So you get nourishment. Now, there's actually data that for some people, doing a complete water fast for 4 days, which is what is comparable to doing the fasting mimicking diet for 5, is not so good for some people. Some people will lose lean body mass. Now, we do not want to lose muscle. Now, what they've shown with the fasting mimicking diet is that lean mass is preserved, which is so important. You definitely do not want to lose any of your lean tissue, your muscle. In addition, what are some of the other benefits that you get when you do either a water fast for 4 days or you decide, like me, to do the fasting mimicking diet? Well, as I mentioned, you get all the benefits that you get from a shorter fast, like you can have weight loss, you can have improvement in metabolic parameters, in blood pressure. In addition, you have reduced inflammation that has been shown. You also increase some brain growth factors, which is really nice. And there's a lot of ongoing studies now that are looking at the role of fasting mimicking diets and dementia. But we have to wait for some of those studies to be done. But we do know that there is some improvement and increase in brain-derived neurotrophic factors. And what else? It stimulates a process called autophagy. Autophagy is like cellular rejuvenation. Well, think about this. If you're living for a day or two and there's no food coming in, the body is kind of inherently lazy and it says, I think I'll just wait and see if some food shows up. But by around day 3, if no food shows up, the body says, uh-oh, now I've really got to do something. I can't wait to be saved. I've got to take action. So at that point, autophagy is triggered. Autophagy means that cells take their internal organelles, their internal structures, and recycle them in what I call the recycling bin called the lysosome. It's a structure that breaks down the components of the cell into its basic components like amino acids and fatty acids, and then the cell reconfigures new structures, internal structures, from the raw ingredients that are created through recycling the existing products. Talk about good use of recycling. So this is amazing. It's like a complete revamping of the cells. Cells become healthier, more functional. They can live longer. Now, think about this. Why can't you live to be 200 years old? Have you ever thought about that? It's because we have what are called telomeres. They're like, some people think of them like the ends of a shoelace. And you know how the little plastic cover comes off and then the whole shoelace kind of unravels and you have just so much. So telomeres are about longevity. So different types of animal species have different telomere length. When you use up your telomeres, then you cannot replicate cells. You can't rejuvenate. Once cells die, they can't be replaced. And there are cells in the body that cannot live indefinitely, and they need to be replaced after they die. That can't happen indefinitely. Well, it turns out, now this is studies in mice, okay? You cannot translate this to humans, but it's interesting to think about it. In mice, when they've done fasting, they found that they kept the telomeres longer, so that mice that got involved in fasting and also caloric restriction, that's where you eat fewer calories but all the nutrients to sustain yourself, which humans do very poorly, by the way. We've talked a little bit, and I'll talk more about caloric restriction, but just in a nutshell, you just eat fewer, about 25% fewer calories a day than what your body would normally need, but somehow you manage to get all the nutrients you want. That just doesn't usually happen. But in mice, in a controlled experiment, you can actually do that. But what they found was that when they did caloric restriction or fasting in mice, they actually lived significantly longer than they ever would naturally live because of the impact on their telomeres. So this is just an interesting thing if we talk about it as a cell. Let's not talk about longevity. We have no human longevity data. But if we talk about a cell, if a cell can live longer because it revamps its internal structures, then that's really good for the organ that it's a cell component of. So let's not think about longevity. Let's just think about optimal functioning of organs. So if you have, for example, a liver cell, and that liver cell revamps itself with autophagy, and you have other liver cells that are revamping themselves with autophagy, guess what? Your liver is going to work better. So that's what autophagy is. Now, it's natural that that would be a triggering event when you have fasting, because if you don't have food coming in, then you have to use what you have. It's kind of like if you think you're in the Great Depression and you don't have any new fabric, any new money to buy new fabric, so you use the drapes. Remember, that was in one of the movies that I'm sure you've seen, and that where they use drapes to make clothing for children. So that's recycling, right? So here the cell is using its existing components to make brand new components out of the basic ingredients. So that makes for a healthier organ, a healthier cell. What else happens? Well, bad cells are triggered to die. So old cells, what we call senescent cells, crappy cells that are just taking up nutrients that you don't have because you're not getting any food. So the body says, let's throw the dead weight overboard. Let's kill off the crappy cells and rejuvenate the good cells. So old yucky cells kill themselves. We call that programmed cell suicide or apoptosis. So you have all your crappy cells, well, at least a bunch of them, killing themselves off. And they've actually shown that organs can actually shrink. But then when you go into the refeeding stage, after you fast, you feed. And when you start eating and you eat nourishing food, you actually stimulate rejuvenation of cells. And once again, in research animals, they have found an increase in production of stem cells. So once again, we want to always distinguish between animal research and human research, because you can't transfer information from animals, but it's really interesting to know this, that you can actually shrink organs, but then they will regrow with new healthy cells. Not every organ, but because we're not going to do that to your heart or your brain, but many organs, including the liver, will get smaller and then get bigger. What else happens? You lose visceral fat. The inflammatory, bad, dangerous fat actually gets less. And there's research being done now looking at fasting and periodic fasting, multi-day fasting, and fasting mimicking diets for fatty liver, a very prevalent condition, not talked about because there's no pharmaceutical for fatty liver. It causes huge metabolic dysfunction in the body, and it's very common now. In fact, fatty liver, which can progress into terrible fibrosis of the liver and liver failure, is now the number one cause of liver transplants in the United States. And fatty liver is even developing in children. So you can imagine the percentage of adults who have fatty liver. It's not easy to diagnose. We check on it in my office by getting ultrasounds of the liver, because we otherwise just can't really know what's going on. And there are people and researchers trying to find better markers to know if someone has fatty liver. But it's very important to resolve it. Exercise is a very good therapy, and so is periodic fasting. So remember, you have to do fasting more than once in this manner to ultimately get the best benefits. And weight loss, as I mentioned, that is something that has been eluding people for so many decades. How to successfully lose weight? Well, periodic fasting, either with a water fast for 3-4 days, or what is so much more usable is the fasting mimicking diet for 5 days. That actually revs up your metabolism as opposed to slowing it down, because the brain and the body says, look, there's no food. We've got to go out and hunt or forage. So we want to be more energetic. So you're revving up your mitochondria to better burn fat, to create more energy, so that you can accomplish everything you need. And the body says, I need to be smart. That's why you're going to have more brain growth factors, and you're going to throw out the crappy cells that are simply using vital resources that we can't waste on them. And you're going to rejuvenate your good cells so that you can survive. Remember, it's all about survival. But these mechanisms are essential for optimizing health and healthy longevity. These are the mechanisms that support metabolic functions, metabolic health, which is how we make energy, distribute energy, store energy. All of these factors must be considered. And if you continually eat and you don't do this type of fasting, you will never be able to trigger these amazing body functions like programmed cell suicide, apoptosis, and autophagy. These are amazing tools that our bodies have evolved with for survival that you can access for healthy longevity. This is so, so important. So, you need to speak to a physician if you have any concerns about your health. I'm not recommending that everyone should just do this themselves. There are some people who should not be doing periodic fasting or fasting mimicking diets. If you're too slim, you have to have some fat. So if your body mass index is below 18, if you're too young, if you're under 21, and certainly under 18, if you're too old, so if you're over 65, you really want to make sure that you are working with a healthcare professional who's familiar with fasting. Even if you're younger, if you have chronic illness, if you are diabetic on diabetic medications, hypertensive on antihypertensive drugs, if you have heart disease, if you have other illnesses, if you've had serious surgery, if you've had heart attacks, strokes, if you have cardiac arrhythmias, these are all potential contraindications to this type of fasting. So please don't experiment on yourself. I'm here to help. I want to make sure no one ever gets in trouble. So I, of course, supervise all of my patients who do periodic fasting, fasting mimicking diets, and any kind of water fasting. And I would urge you to work with your doctor or healthcare professional who is knowledgeable about this type of fasting, because to me, that's what keeps it safest. I like to supervise my patients when they undergo these types of fasts, especially the first time around, and also ensure that they are proper candidates for such surgery, for such a wonderful type of tool, doing a fasting mimicking diet. So what would I also consider as an exclusion? For example, women who are actively trying to get pregnant or are breastfeeding. That's not the time for this type of thing. And if you are very frail, if you have very poor balance, if you tend to get faint or lightheaded, please don't just jump into this type of fasting. So, in summary, our bodies are designed for survival. When food is scarce, our bodies have these innate mechanisms to allow us to optimize survival, creating these amazing dynamics in our bodies, triggering cell suicide to kill off crappy cells, rejuvenating healthy cells with autophagy. These are the tools that you can access, not necessarily for survival, but for healthy longevity. And that's what we all want, right? Not just a long lifespan, but a health span, so that every day is a day that you can do anything you want, accomplish all your dreams, never live in a nursing home, never lose your ability to do the things you want to do. So we shall continue the dialogue. So be sure you follow all the upcoming episodes on fasting for women. Thank you so much. Stay well and stay safe.